All right, everybody, let's get this party started. Welcome, class, to Classics 160B1. Meet the Ancients! I, of course, am your professor, Dr. Rob Steffen. And today is a very, very exciting day. Now that we are done with the midterm, we are moving westward, right? We're getting in our trireme, and we are going to sail west from Greece to Italy as we introduce the wild world of ancient Rome. So let's go ahead and bring down the projector and turn down the lights and fire this thing up for lecture 9.1, The Founding of Rome. All right, let's see what we go ahead and have on our docket for today. We'll start with a few announcements. Just make sure that everybody kind of remembers how to do class after like a week off. Well, not off, but like watching a movie. And then what we're going to do is we're going to set the scene, right? We're going to kind of go back in time, figure out where we left off from our story with the Hellenistic world, and we'll see how kind of Rome starts to rather forcefully enter that story. And then we're going to go back in time to see how we got there, right? How did we get to the point where Rome was able to march in to these to these cultures, right? And kingdoms that were relatively strong and successfully defeat them all one by one. So that's what we're going to start today. In terms of announcements, let's go ahead and see what we got. All right, go ahead and put your screen into speaker view. If it's not already, then you can see me. You can see the slides. If you have a question, go ahead and fire that question to your TA. They will get back to you, or they'll funnel that to me, and I will get back to you. Karen and Zach, how are we on exams? Are we looking good on exams graded?
I finished mine last Monday, actually. I only have to correct the makeup exam from the student that contacted you, but I'm good.
Excellent. Zach?
Yeah, we're good.
All right, perfect. And let me make sure I got Blake on as a host here. I don't know where Blake is. All right, so the exams should be good to go, and you can take a look at those. Again, the multiple choice is auto-graded, the TA is graded the essays, and if you did well on the exam, congratulations, that's awesome, right? I looked at the kind of grades overall. I was really happy with the way things turned out, right? Not that everything was perfect, but in general, I was really pleased with the way things went. If, let's say, you did a little bit less than either you had hoped for or you expected, have no fear, right? It's not like this was 50% of your grade for the class. It's a relatively minor portion of your grade. I think it's like only 10% or something of the whole grade for the class. And there are plenty of other ways to make up those points, right? Come to class, get your attendance scores, do well on the weekly writing assignments, study hard for the final exam, and keep working on that project, all right? So you do that, you guys are going to be in great shape. Okay, so let's see, what else? Yeah, overall, you guys are doing great. Keep it up, right? One of the difficult things, I hope you guys are feeling recharged. I'm feeling like a little recharged. I went up to Flagstaff for a few days, and just to get out of Tucson was very, very nice. These semesters are really long, right? It's like 16 or 17 weeks if you don't have a spring break in there. And so, yeah, just kind of take stock of where you are, make sure that you got your head on straight, that you're feeling okay, get like a good night's sleep, get some exercise, and get ready for the second half of the course. And again, I'm here to help you. Karen and Blake and Zach, they're all here to help you. Anything we can do along the way to make the second half of this course successful, we will do that. Okay, so let's see, what else? In terms of honors projects, so I kind of toned that down a little bit towards the midterm, just because I didn't want to have those things competing and having you kind of spread too thin. We're going to pick up with that again in earnest on Friday. If you're working on one of those, don't worry about having anything kind of due this Friday. Just be around and ready to participate. And what we'll try to do is spend, again, the last kind of half of Friday's class working on that. So if you've got like the monument you want ready to go, in terms of like having chosen it, that's all I need you to do for right now, and then come to Friday's class ready to work. Let's see, what else? Will exam answers be available so I can view what I missed? We're not going to do that overall, and the reason for that is that I just don't want like the questions and answers kind of getting out into the wild. And in large part, it's so hard to make multiple choice questions. TAs, I don't know if you've ever had the chance of actually doing this, but it is like, okay, it seems like kind of a dumb and silly thing. It is very difficult to find like the sweet spot on a question between like something that's challenging enough that like you have to have paid attention to get it, but also that's like not so challenging that like it's completely impossible. And then I also have to do that by like putting myself, right? Even though I've like been through college and then like 7 years of grad school and then I was like a professor for 5 years or whatever, I have to somehow like get my brain back into like the brain of like a 19-year-old who's been doing this course for 8 weeks instead of like studying this stuff for like 20 years and try to get a sense for like what kind of level that is. So anyway, I really tried to set that thing up in a fair manner to reward the people who came to class and took notes and that sort of thing. But anyway, so I'm not going to release the answers. If there's a particular question that you had a question about or something, feel free to touch base with the TA or touch base with me, and we can talk about that. But anyway, I just want to be able to prevent having to come up with giant multiple choice things every single semester. So that's my logic. I know it's not perfect, but that's kind of the way I'm thinking of it. Okay, well, let's see. I've got to get back into lecturing mode. It feels like ages since I've done this. I was just hiking around in Flagstaff, and it was so beautiful. It was snowing up there, and it snowed down here too. That was so cool when we woke up and there was snow in the mountains. All right, but somebody needs to talk about ancient Rome. It might as well be me. Let's figure out where we left off last time. Okay. So, there we go. Setting the scene. Here's where we finished our story last time, right? Remember the story of Alexander? He goes on this epic conquest of the Persian Empire, making it all the way to India. And then he dies on the way back, right? And on his deathbed, he's sitting there and he's like, I'm leaving my empire to the strongest. And all his generals and his family are like, that is a completely useless answer. And so they start dividing things, right? They go to take Alexander's empire, right? Which, I don't know why this is in, what is this? In the German or something? That includes like, right, Macedon and Greece and Thrace and Anatolia, and Mesopotamia and Egypt and Persia, right, all the way to India. They start taking off and taking different aspects of that empire. Ptolemy, one of his generals, actually takes the body of Alexander himself and runs away to Egypt to found the Ptolemaic dynasty there. Which, interesting fact, like the Ptolemies, right, the actual lineage of Ptolemies lasts longer than any single other dynasty in Egypt. They actually have like a very successful like 300-year long run there. But things split apart, and then these different groups start battling with each other for the next like 300 years, okay? So for 300 years, you've got the Ptolemies fighting the Antigonids and the Seleucids, and they just kind of are trying to put Humpty Dumpty back together again, and they can't quite do it. And then what happens is slowly, and from the west, a new empire arises, right? We've got Rome, and they start kind of allying with different kingdoms, right? Different successor kingdoms. And then they start kind of using those alliances to pick off other kingdoms, and then they switch their alliances and they break their alliances. And one by one, Rome is able to take over every single one of these kind of successor kingdoms, the successors to Alexander the Great. So what we want to do today is we want to start the story of how the heck did that actually happen? Like, where did Rome come from? How did they get powerful enough to like conquer the successors to the greatest conqueror the world had ever seen. So, let's go ahead and figure out the answer to that. And to begin our story, we've got to take a look at Italy long before Rome ever shows up. All right? So, what we're doing here, right, we're looking at Italy. We've got the mainland of Greece over here. Remember, when we're thinking of the core of the Greek world, we're kind of thinking of this whole area, right? So modern day mainland Greece, all the islands, western modern day Turkey, that's kind of central Greece right there. And now we're moving and sailing west to the Italian peninsula. So that's the thing that's shaped like a boot. It's kicking the football, that is the triangular football, that is Sicily here. And that's where we're going to center our story today. Can anybody tell me a few differences between like what we have? It's kind of hard to tell on a map like this, but like, just what do you guys think geographically? Go ahead and throw it in the chat. What are some of the differences between what we have with the Greek kind of core here, right? Versus like the Italian peninsula? What are some of the geographic differences and how might those affect history? All right, so what do we have? Fewer mountains, yes. One is like, it is a little bit difficult to see. Italy does have a mountain range that runs all the way down the center, right? The spine of Italy here, called the Apennines. But they're not that tall, right? They're like shorter than the Catalinas. Something like 4,500 feet, 5,000 feet tall. Greece, again, a little difficult to tell from this map. Greece is like, the whole thing is kind of mountainous. So that's a good one. A few people mentioned this, right? Like this is like one contiguous landmass, right? Like Italy is skinny and there's a lot of coastline for sure, but at least it's like one contiguous landmass. And when we look at Greece over here, right? We've got the mainland Greece and we've got the Peloponnese and we've got Crete and we've got the Cyclades and all these islands. We've got all these jutting peninsulas of Ionia. Yes, so that's a big one as well, right? A contiguous area versus lots of little islands. And what do you guys think about how might that play out? Like the fact that Italy is kind of a contiguous area versus Greece being a lot of different islands. What effect might that have on history? Yeah, to some extent, so you guys are all kind of touching on the same kind of thing, right? That to some extent, it's easier to maintain rule over a contiguous area than it is to maintain rule over a bunch of different little islands. And in large part, that's kind of sort of what we see. So let's go ahead and see how that actually develops. Okay, now, in the early days, I'm going to mention like some different cultures and sites and things like that. You don't need to remember all the specificities of that. You do want to remember this, all right? Remember how when we talked about Greece in comparison to the Near East, right? Like when Egypt has the pyramids, like Greece has like a large house with like a tile roof. We get the same thing when we compare Greece to Italy, right? So during the middle of the Bronze Age, right? The kind of second millennium BC, the 1000s BC. When we look at Greece, we've got like the palace of Minos at Knossos, right? We've got the fortress at Mycenae. At that same time, when this is happening on Crete, when we take a look at what's going on in Italy, this is like the biggest site we got. It's called Nola. It's kind of near Mount Vesuvius in the Bay of Naples. Bronze Age Italy is like not the most exciting place ever, at least for an archaeologist, all right? Or an archaeologist who likes monumental architecture. So just like Greece was kind of a late starter compared to the Near East, Italy is kind of a late starter compared to Greece. So again, the specific names you're not going to need to know as I go through this, but that general idea, that's a good one to write down there. All right, so let's start our story very early on. The first kind of distinct cultures come out during the Neolithic. Anybody remember what happens during the Neolithic? Can somebody throw that in the chat real quick? What do we associate with the Neolithic? Farming, that's right, Hunter, you got it, good, right? Settling down in one place, animal domestication, all these wonderful things. And so we can start to see the remains of some of these settlements in Italy, not too much later, right? Timeline-wise, it's about the same, not super complex material culture. But the kind of transition from the Neolithic to the Bronze Age, the Bronze Age just doesn't get quite as complex in Italy as it does in Greece. So again, we're looking at the site of Nola. These are some of the largest buildings we've got from this period. And what we're talking about is a house that's like these kind of long houses that are maybe 25, 50 feet long. Not crazy long. Okay, so Italy's kind of a late starter. The cultures that first kind of start getting very distinctive, the first one is called the Urnfeld culture at the very end of the Bronze Age. And this is not the most creative name ever. The Urnfeld culture is named after these sorts of urns. And what these things do is they hold the ashes of the deceased. And what we're looking at are these kind of two-part urns where you've got like kind of the vase itself and then some sort of cap to it. And over the next couple hundred years, these become a really distinctive kind of material marker of culture in Italy kind of during the later part of the Bronze Age and then into the Iron Age. We do get some artistic depictions as well, which are like, again, not the most complex thing ever, but give us some sort of insight into what culture's like at the time. So we get these chariots up here, hunting, fishing, that sort of thing. But in large part, if you ever go to a museum, it's a museum in Italy that talks about this earliest phase. It's going to be these sorts of vases that really stick out to you as you're like, oh, all right, that is like some of the kind of most prototypical material culture of this early period in Italy. And what the Urnfeld culture kind of progresses to is the next one's called the Villanovan culture, based on the city where most of these were found. And essentially what you're getting is just simply a more complex version of what you had previously, right? So again, these are the actual material remains here, where you're getting these vases. The ashes of the deceased would have been placed in the vase, and then you've got some sort of fancy kind of lid to those vases. So during the Bronze Age, during the early part of the Iron Age, we're getting cremation burial practices, and they're going into these sorts of urns. Now, shortly after the Villanovan culture, we get a real differentiation of different tribes throughout Italy, okay? You don't need to remember the names of all these. The takeaway point is that Italy was a really diverse place, all right? So you've got the Celts up in the northern part of Italy, right? And the Celtic culture, there are lots of different branches of the Celts. But that goes into Gaul, modern-day France, all the way up into Britain. Those are all different Celtic cultures, and they are populous up in the northern part of Italy as well. They become a real thorn in Rome's side. And it's actually a Celtic invasion. We'll talk about this next week, I think. It's a Celtic invasion in 390 BC that kind of like changes the direction that Rome goes. It's after that Rome like starts to think like, all right, that sucked. We're not having any more of that. Let's get some sweet walls and let's go ahead and develop a military and kind of expand this culture so we don't have to deal with these sorts of invasions. So we've got the Celts up here. We've got the Veneti up here. They're known as metal workers, right? That's where we get our name Venice from. The Ligures are up here in the north as well. They kind of become known as like, one of the things we'll talk about are these Roman triumphs. And what you have to do is win a victory over a foreign group in order to have a triumph and kill so many people along the way or take so many prisoners. And whenever a Roman general really wants to have a triumph and they need somebody to conquer, they always go start fighting the poor Ligures up here and conquering them and getting their triumph that way. But you got lots of different other ones, the Samnites down here, the Umbri. Rome itself is part of a tribe called the Latins, right? That's where we get our language Latin from. But they're one of the Latin cultures there. We've got the Etruscans up here in modern-day Tuscany, okay? And we're going to talk a lot about them today because that's kind of one of the most sophisticated cultures in early Italy. And then the other thing we've got, right when Rome is getting started, we've got the Greeks setting up shop in the southern part of the Italian peninsula here and in Sicily, right? So again, the takeaway point, Italy is an incredibly diverse place right when Rome is getting started. And so we've seen this map before when we talked about Greece, right? So we've got Phoenician colonization all across the coast of North Africa. We've got the Greeks going all over the place. The Greeks are a big deal in early Italy. When we look at the island of Sicily, they've got different tribes all over the place there too, right? We've got the Elymians, the Sicanians, the Sicels, all these kind of local groups. We saw last time, right? Not last time, but in the first half of the course, that Sicily is also dominated by Greek settlements and Carthaginian settlements as well, right? And so we've got Syracuse, and we've got Gela, and we've got Acragas, and we've got Selinus, and we've got Himera, right? And so it's a relatively diverse place, and the Greeks are really, along with the Etruscans, kind of some of the most culturally advanced of the different groups in Italy at the time. And so that's something to keep in mind, right? That when Rome gets started, Greece is way ahead of Rome, right? Like when we're talking about the early stages of Rome, Greece is like, they're building like sweet temples. They've got awesome material culture and armor and vases and language and bronze working. And Rome's like a piddly little thing at the beginning. But we will see that it grows quite quickly. All right, so we've talked a lot about the Greeks, right? Hopefully you have some sense of who the Greeks are and what they did. We're not going to rehash all of that. I do want to talk about the Etruscans because during our period of time, right, we're talking the 8th century, the 700s, same time where kind of things start exploding in Greece as well. That's when Rome gets started. And at that time, the Etruscans are really the ones who are a big deal. So when we're looking at the Etruscans, right, we're looking in kind of like northwestern Italy, modern day Tuscany, and we'll see that we actually get our word Tuscany from one of the Roman words for the Etruscans. So the Greeks called the Etruscans the Tyrrhenoi, all right, and if you've ever seen the Tyrrhenian Sea, right, that's named after the Greek word for the Etruscans, so it's kind of like the Etruscan Sea. The Romans called the Etruscans either the Tusci or the Etrusci, and so our word Tuscany, right, and our word Etruscans very much comes from the Roman version of them. We think that the Etruscans themselves called themselves something completely different, right, going by the name the Rassena or the Rassena. Now, one of the difficulties in understanding the Etruscans is that we've got a lot of writings from the Greeks about the Etruscans. And we've got a lot of writings from the Romans about the Etruscans. We have almost no writings from the Etruscans about the Etruscans. And so we got a lot of different kind of stories coming from different places, but not a lot of stories from them themselves. And one of the big questions here, let's see if I can get out of the way, is basically about Etruscan origins, right? And according to ancient authors, again, not the Etruscans themselves, but there are two different theories. So our main Greek guy, Herodotus, right, says that the Etruscans started in Anatolia, and then they sail westward, right, to Italy. And it's something kind of along the line when we see the foundation of Rome's story later on. It kind of parallels the Homeric epic hero of Aeneas, right, who was a Trojan prince who flees Troy over in Anatolia, right, and he lands on the shores of Italy. So he's kind of building on that tradition. Now we've got another historian, this guy Dionysius of Halicarnassus, who says that the Etruscans are kind of local to Italy, right, that they kind of evolved out of these previous cultures. And for the most part, archaeologists kind of agree more with that second theory. And the way they've done that is they've started looking at the burial strategies And they saw that in the Bronze Age, right, that we've got these little like cremation urns with their like cute little hats on them. And then we go through this period where we get a mixture at sites where like half the people are in these cremation urns and then half the people are in like actual inhumation burials. And then that transitions to other sites where eventually it's just inhumation burials. And so we can see that continuity of material culture slowly changing, but we don't get an influx of something entirely new from elsewhere. Okay, so who were the Etruscans? How do we identify Etruscan material culture? One of the things that ends up happening is that the Greeks have a huge influence on the Etruscans. It's like they start trading together and the Etruscans are like, this Greek stuff is awesome, right? So they love Greek pottery. They love like Greek armor and clothing styles, right? They adopt to a large part, right, like kind of Greek religious architecture. They kind of, sort of adopt the Greek alphabet. So one of the really cool things, if you guys ever get the chance to study abroad, one of our big programs is in Italy, and it's based in the town of Orvieto. And Orvieto actually gets its name from like a portmanteau of the Latin words, the urbs vitus, the old city. And because it was an old Etruscan city before the Romans took it over. And outside the city, if you go down the hillside, there are these Etruscan tombs that kind of dot the landscape right down the hill. And above the tombs, they basically write the cenotaph, right? They write the name of the deceased using Greek letters. But like, sometimes they'll write it backwards or they'll flip the letters around, but they're clearly using Greek letters to write in the Etruscan language. And one of the very interesting things is that like scholars still only have a very, very rough idea of how to translate Etruscan. We don't have it perfectly kind of worked out yet, in large part because there are so few texts. And so one of the super interesting things, right, is that like we can go to those tombs and we can read the way it would have sounded because we know the way Greek letters sound, but we can't necessarily translate all the different words, right? It's like, you know, if somebody wrote a foreign language but using the Latin script, you could read the way that it sounds without really knowing what it means. That's kind of the parallel that's going on with the Etruscans. But either way, material culture-wise, the Etruscans love Greek stuff. All right, so politically, the Etruscans are also kind of, sort of Greek, all right? And so what we're looking at when we have these kind of different city-states here is the same thing. Politically, they're city-states. They're all independent, right, in terms of politics, but they share a culture, right? They share cultural ways, they share a religion, they share a language, they share kind of different types of government, but not like, you know, each one is still politically independent. And we'll see that this actually becomes a problem later on. Remember how we said earlier that one of the things that allows Rome to take over the Hellenistic kingdoms is the fact that those kingdoms keep fighting with each other and they can never unify? Kind of sort of the same things happen with the Etruscans, right? You've got all these powerful city-states, but because they never come together, Rome's able to start picking them off one by one. One of the other kind of cool things is that what you're looking at over here, these are known as the fasces. And what it is it's an axe surrounded by a bundle of sticks, right? And it's a symbol of power in Etruria. And later on, the Romans adopt this, and they actually have these things that they carry out in front of the magistrates. And when there's like a single axe, you're in like a time of like peace, and when it's a double axe, you're in like a time of war. But these get adopted by the Romans, and then they actually get readopted back in the 20th century when we get fascism in Italy. It's Mussolini drawing upon the iconography of the ancient Roman Empire, which in turn is drawing upon the symbols of power of the Etruscans as like a symbol of power during that period of time. Okay, so the takeaway point socio-politically, though, is that the Etruscans are very, very similar to the Greeks in the sense of politically independent city-states that share a culture. Now, economically, right, the Etruscans are big traders, right? They're across the sea. They have lots of trade contacts with Greece. One of the interesting things is that when you look at Greek pottery, if you go to a museum in the United States and you look at a bunch of Greek pottery there, most of the time, most of it is actually Etruscan in nature. Like the Etruscans start by trading with the Greeks because they really like this form of pottery, and then they start trying to do it on their own. And so most of the vases that we have that are like high quality enough to go into a museum actually come from Etruscan tombs. They become very popular kind of gifts, grave goods for the deceased. And so a lot of the ones that are still well preserved come from Etruria. They're also known as like very masterful metal workers. This is one of the coolest statues from Etruscan antiquity. What we've got, this is known as the Chimera of Arezzo. And so the Chimera was this like mythical beast, right? That has the head of a lion, and it's got a goat's head sticking out of its back. And for its tail, it's like a poisonous snake. And the Greek hero Bellerophon ends up slaying the Chimera. But in terms of like right around 500, right, very early on, in terms of Rome's history, the Etruscans are producing masterful metal craftsmanship. One of the interesting things, when we start to parallel Etruria, right, and the Etruscans with the Greeks, seems to be the position of women within culture. And with the Greeks, women played in large part a very important role in the private sphere. And so when you look at a lot of the material culture, and you look at a lot of the institutions in Greek society, women appear absent because they're not in the public sphere, right? Their kind of role is in large part within the house. When we look at the Etruscans and we look at the different types of material culture that they've got, it appears that women show up in a far more diverse area, or far more diverse areas of culture. So one of the cool things, one of the ways that they bury the deceased in the Etruscan culture is in these large terracotta, right, or ceramic sarcophagi. And very, very frequently, they put both the man and the woman, right, in sculptural form on these sarcophagi. And honestly, I just think it's really cute and kind of adorable that I don't know. I mean, it's like a man and his wife, and they're going to spend eternity together. And so, on the one hand, it's very important culturally, the kind of gender roles that we get and how we identify those. But also, I just find it a very kind of touching aspect of Etruscan culture. They also show up in mirrors, other implements within the house. We know from different frescoes within tombs that they dined with the men at banquets. So whereas the Greeks might have a symposium that's all men, the Etruscans would invite women into those sorts of things. They could attend sporting events. That's something that didn't really happen in the Greek world. So if you were a woman and you went to the Olympics in ancient Greece, if you were a married woman and went to the Olympics, you'd get thrown off a cliff, which is kind of a harsh punishment. But the Etruscans, they're yeah, the more the merrier. Everybody gets to come attend the games. In terms of Etruscan sports, we can look to the frescoes to see a kind of wide diversity of sports in Etruria. We see things like wrestling here, right? We've got chariot racing. We can tell this is a sport, right? No armor, no weapons. We have got some kind of priests or judges. And we see all sorts of other things too, hunting and fishing and running and boxing and wrestling. So sporting culture seems to be a very important part of Etruscan culture as well. And we'll see a little later on, or if you take my sports class, that looking at the evolution of these frescoes, we may actually be seeing the kind of birth of the gladiatorial games that we associate with later Rome as well. All right, religiously, the Etruscan gods are very closely connected to nature. Kind of sort of in the same way that the very early Greek gods are also very connected to nature, and then they take on anthropomorphic, right, human forms kind of later on. And one of the things that Rome does is Rome basically kind of starts combining aspects of all these. They've got their own gods, they borrow some from the Etruscans, they borrow some from the Greeks, mash them all together, And so we can see some of the linguistic similarities too, that like the Etruscan Uni becomes the Roman Juno, right? And we associate that with the Greek goddess Hera. Or the Etruscan Minerva is paralleled with the Greek god Athena, and then that becomes the Roman god Minerva. Now, one of the things that is a big part of Etruscan religion, right, maybe more so than Greek religion, is trying to understand the will of the gods. How do you understand what the gods want you to do? And the Etruscans do this through this process of divination. And they've got a lot of different ways that they can kind of read the will of the gods, right? So sometimes they will interpret the thunder and the lightning and the shapes it makes and the frequency of it and where it shows up in the sky. Other times they'll look at patterns of birds, and when we get to the actual foundation of Rome's story, the flight of birds actually ends up playing a very important role. But the grossest and coolest of all the different ways is that they'd like sacrifice a sheep and pull out its liver, and then based on the shape of the liver, they would like be able to tell what the gods want you to do. And one of the coolest artifacts from all of Greco-Roman antiquity is what we're looking at right here. This is called the liver of Piacenza. Piacenza is a city in Italy where it was found. And what we're looking at is like a kind of like a textbook. So it's a diagram, a bronze diagram of a liver, and it's like kind of partitioned into different areas with then little Etruscan inscriptions written in Greek letters about like what that area kind of would represent or tell you about the will of the gods. And so I just think this is so cool that we have like a textbook in the shape of a liver telling you how to interpret a liver like within Etruscan religion. So divination, a very, very big part of that process. Now, when we look at sculpture, right, it's got similarities to Greek sculpture. It doesn't look, something like this doesn't look all that different. But one of the big differences is that the Etruscans, right, like the material seems very, very different. When we're looking at the Greek world, they get big into stone sculpture, right? Limestone and especially marble sculptures become the pinnacle of Greek sculpture, right? When we look at the Etruscan world, their kind of form seems very similar, right? We've got the little archaic smile, the almond-shaped eyes, the kind of braided hair, the idealized body, right, striding forward. But they're very frequently made out of terracotta or ceramics, right? They're made out of pottery rather than stone. So again, very similar, different kind of material here. When we look at the tombs, again, I talked a little bit about this. These are like, again, you walk down from the city of Orvieto. They're right down below the cliffside there. And the Etruscans end up burying their dead in these little things called tumuli, right? These little hills, or these little mounds that look an awful lot like hobbit holes, right? And so they're really cool to kind of go into. And when you go in, they're very brightly decorated, very frequently with banqueting scenes, sporting festivals, hunting scenes, celebrations. And one of the things that makes us think about is that perhaps the Etruscans had a slightly more developed sense of the afterlife compared to Greek religion, because we get so much iconography that seems to be celebrating within the funerary realm. When we look at pottery, right, I talked about this a little bit. We can see that at first, again, the Etruscans are adopting Greek pottery through trade, and then they figure out how to do it themselves. So this is like an Athenian vase here. This is an Etruscan vase. If you ask me what the difference is, I can't tell you. If I went to a museum and like was looking at two vases, I couldn't tell you one that's made in Greece versus one that's made in Etruria. They're that close when it comes to the execution. But the Etruscans do formulate their own form of pottery as well, and this is known, the term for this is bucaro. That's how you'd say that in Italian, bucaro pottery. And what it is, it's a burnished black kind of glaze on the pottery, and it resembles, right, what it actually looks like is kind of like shiny, maybe slightly tarnished silver. And this actually gives us an insight into what the Greeks and Etruscans are trying to do with their fancy pottery. They're trying to mimic metal vases. And we don't have a lot of metal vases. We talked about that, right? These get melted down, those metal vases. And the metal vases would have been far more expensive. And so what they're trying to do with their fancy black burnished pottery is actually mimic that in a much, much cheaper format. All right, now, when it comes to temples, right, we can see similarities and differences as well. So on the right-hand side, we've got a recreation of the Parthenon. Has anybody ever been to this? This is actually in Nashville. They built it for like a World's Fair or something like that. Life-size recreation of the Parthenon. They redid the sculptures on top. I haven't seen it. It looks kind of awesome. On the left-hand side over there, we've got a model of a temple, an Etruscan temple, to the god Apollo. And so you can see some similarities, right? Some columns out in front, the general triangular pediment, the tile roofs, the rectangular shape. But you can see some differences as well, right? So on the one hand, the Greek temple has these columns, they're the peristyle all the way around. The Etruscan temple, just the columns out in front, right? We can see the Greek one is very close to the ground. The Etruscan one's kind of raised up on a podium. The Greek one has some statues, right, on the pediment here. The Etruscan one, they love their statues. Those like terracotta statues of Apollo, they have them walking all over the roof of the temple. It looks sweet. So again, kind of some similarities but differences. What we'll see when we get to the Romans, they're actually adopting temples that look far more like the Etruscans than like the Greek temple. Even though they kind of, you can see similarities all over the place. The Roman ones really adopt far, far closer to the Etruscan temples. So speaking of that, the Etruscans also loved the god Heracles. Go ahead and put your attendance in for today. It is Quiz 20, March 15th, and go ahead and select brown as your answer for today. So Quiz 20, March 15th, choose brown as your answer, and then we'll finish up with a kind of, maybe we won't actually do the myth of the founding of Rome, but we'll situate where Rome is. That's what we'll do for the last couple minutes today. All right, so go ahead and put brown in there. I'm going to start talking a little bit about where Rome is situated within this kind of broader context of all these different tribes here. And then we'll actually have the myth of the founding to start class on Wednesday. Okay, so situating Rome within the larger context of early Italy. So we just saw this earlier today, right? And what we talked about was all exactly correct, right? Italy is much more geographically contiguous. It's got this mountain range down the middle here, but it's not a particularly high mountain range. It's tough to tell on this image, but there are quite a few navigable rivers, right? So the Po comes down from the Alps up here. You've got the Arno that runs through Etruria or Tuscany, right? Modern day Florence. You've got the Tiber River, which runs from the Apennines down through where the city of Rome is going to be, out into the sea. And all those rivers are navigable, right? They're large enough that you can actually sail ships up and down those rivers. And so that makes it not only a contiguous land area, but one that's easy to reach via water as well. So there aren't any kind of major barriers the way that you'd get with a place like Egypt, and it's not as spread out geographically or kind of, separated as a place like Greece. And we saw all these different tribes. And the thing to kind of remember is that we're setting our story the very beginning of Rome. Rome is founded sometime in the 700s BC, right? The 8th century BC. And during that time, the Etruscans, right, are a much, much bigger deal than Rome. And during that time, the Greeks are a much, much bigger deal than Rome. And during that time, all these other tribes that you don't hear much about anymore, the Umbri, the Samnites, they might not be a bigger deal than Rome, but they're certainly like no less than Rome. And so the point there kind of is that there's no reason, at the very start at least, that we would expect Rome to rise to such kind of lofty heights over the next few hundred years. Now, when we think of Rome, this is our conception, right? Like this metropolis, right? This urban fabric that spreads throughout the ancient city. And eventually it is there, all right? So we've got like 1 million people in Rome at its height in like the 1st century AD, all right? But back when Rome's founded, we gotta like take away all this stuff. And we actually are gonna take away some of this stuff as well. But what you can see, Rome is known as the city of 7 hills, right? And you can see them here on this model. The model, by the way, is both of these models are in the Museum of Roman Civilization in the city of Rome in the EUR district. And this is the fascist district of Rome that was built by Mussolini back in the 1930s. And I would highly encourage, if anybody makes it to Rome, take the subway out there, take the metro out there, and go exploring. It's super wild, right? It's all architecture built from the 1930s. He builds this museum to Roman civilization. And the thing is, there is nothing real in the museum. The whole museum is just models and replicas of like the greatest works of art from throughout the Roman Empire. So they'd take like a statue from North Africa and make a model and then put it in this museum. And one of the really cool things, so like, this is not a computer generated image. This is a photo of an actual physical model that's huge, right? It's like 30 feet by 30 feet or something. And this is another one of these physical models here. But what you want to be looking at, right, is in the earliest days, we've got 7 major hills in Rome, and that it's these hilltops that end up being the locus of the very first kind of settlements in the city. And here's kind of a top-down plan of that. So we've got the Capitoline, that becomes the religious center. The Palatine, that's going to become the kind of political center. We've got all these other hills. And in the earliest days, all these areas between the hills end up flooded. It's actually a little easier to see on this kind of image here, where you get the hills. All the areas in between would have been flooded. And so it's just these little hilltops with just these little tribes living on there in the earliest days. So what we're going to do is we are going to start our story about the mythical foundations of Rome. On Wednesday, we will hear the story of Romulus and Remus, the story of Aeneas. We will pick it up again then. Have a wonderful couple days until then, and I will see you Wednesday at noon. All right, everyone, have a good one. We'll see you later.